Hey everybody, Mr. Kobe here. This is the makeup lab activity for the liver catalase hydrogen peroxide activity that we did in class. So you should have your lab handout that you were given and follow along with the video. So let's start with test tube number 1. What's inside test tube number 1? You're going to see in a minute there's going to be a video clip that plays. In test tube number 1 is 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide and a fresh piece of liver, cut up liver, small pieces of cut up liver that fit into test tubes. And this liver has been sitting out a little bit and it's at room temperature. Here we go. Okay, so in this container is a bunch of liver that I've cut up into these little tiny pieces right there. And I've already set up test tube number 1. Let me get my camera good. And you can see there's 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide in the test tube already. I'm going to take the tweezers that you just saw, and I'm going to drop the piece of liver into test tube number 1. And you can see the liver needs a little help getting down there, so I'm going to use the stirring rod and push the liver into the hydrogen peroxide. And you can see instantly a bunch of bubbles are forming. Already the bubbles are about 2/3 of the way up the test tube. Yeah, about 2/3 of the way up the test tube right there. And you can see within just a few moments the bubbles were produced. And here's something that maybe that you'll find interesting. If I use my fingers and touch the bottom of the test tube, it's a little warm to the touch. That warmth that I'm feeling right now at the bottom of the test tube, that warmth wasn't there a few moments ago. So, on your lab handout, please make the observations that you just witnessed. Okay, so did you notice, test tube number 1, when the liver came into contact with the hydrogen peroxide, bubbles immediately started to form. And the bubbles went up about 2/3 the height of the test tube. Now, when I touched the bottom of the test tube with my fingers, the test tube felt warm. And so these are some observations that I hope you will note and then use these observations to answer some of the analysis questions. So now I'm moving on to test tube number 2. What's inside test tube? Test tube number 2, you'll see in the video, is I'm going to transfer the leftover liquid from test tube number 1. I'm going to transfer that liquid into test tube number 2. And then I'm going to add a fresh piece of liver. Here we go. Okay, for test tube number 2, I'm going to take test tube number 1. There's still some used liquid in test tube number 1. I'm going to pour the liquid from test tube number 1 into test tube number 2, but I don't want the liver. I just want the used liquid. So there we go. That's pretty good. And you can see test tube number 2 has the used liquid inside of it. That liquid used to be in test tube number 1. Now, for test tube number 2, I'm going to take a fresh piece of liver. Here's a fresh piece of liver, and I'm going to put it into test tube number 2. And I'll use my stirring rod to push it down into the used leftover liquid. Almost there, and there we go. And you can see, test tube number 2, nothing really happened. Very few bubbles, maybe a little tiny couple bubbles, but pretty much a nothing. Test tube number 2, there's no real chemical reaction, and I hope you can figure out why that is. Okay, so did you notice that when the liver came into contact with the leftover liquid, very few bubbles, if any, formed? And so what does this show about the leftover liquid? I'm not going to directly answer the question right now. That's for you to figure out in your analysis. Now, in the next part, I'm going to go back to test tube number 1. What's inside test tube number 1? At this point, it's just the used piece of liver. If you remember, I emptied the leftover liquid out of it. So it's just the used piece of liver right now, but in a moment I'm going to add 2 milliliters of fresh hydrogen peroxide. Okay, so now I'm going to come back to test tube number 1. What I've done, I've measured 2 milliliters of fresh peroxide in my graduated cylinder right there. Let me set up the camera. There we go. And I'm going to take my graduated cylinder and I'm going to pour 2 milliliters of fresh peroxide onto the liver from test tube 1. Remember, this liver has already been used once. Here we go. And you can see, even though the liver's been used once, when I added fresh peroxide, once again, almost immediately the bubbles formed. You can see the bubbles went up about 2/3 of the way of the test tube. Almost immediately. So you can hopefully make that observation in your data table and move on to some of the analysis questions. Okay, so did you notice that when the liver came into contact, when the used liver came into contact with the fresh hydrogen peroxide, bubbles immediately started to form. And so the bubbles went up about 2/3 the height of the test tube. And so what does this suggest about the reusability of enzymes such as catalase? That's for you to answer in your analysis. I'm not going to directly answer that right now. All right, so now we're moving on to part B of the activity. And in test tube number 3 right here, what's inside is going to be a heated piece of liver and 2 milliliters of fresh hydrogen peroxide. Let's watch. Okay, in this next test tube, you can see the test tube is labeled heat. What I did was I've added 2 milliliters of fresh peroxide, and I heated, there it is, I heated that piece of liver in just coffee cup in hot water in the microwave for about a minute or 2. And so I basically boiled a piece of liver. Now using my tweezers, I'm going to drop this boiled piece of liver, this heated piece of liver, into the fresh peroxide. Here we go. And you can see there's no reaction. If I hold it closer to the camera, no real bubbles that I can really see. So the heated liver, the liver that was placed in extreme heat, produced very few bubbles when placed into hydrogen peroxide. Make this observation into your data table. Okay, so did you notice that when the liver came into contact, when the boiled liver came into contact with the fresh hydrogen peroxide, nothing really happened. Very few, if any, bubbles were produced. And so what does this show about the effects of heat on enzymes such as catalase? I'm not going to directly answer that right now. That's for you to conclude in your analysis. So look at part C of this activity now. Part C of the activity. What's inside this test tube? Test tube number 4. Well, a piece of liver that's been soaked in acid and 2 milliliters of fresh hydrogen peroxide. Let's go ahead and watch. Okay, in this next test tube, I've already measured out 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. And in this little beaker labeled acid, the acid just happens to be vinegar, but there's been a piece of liver soaking in this vinegar, acidic vinegar, for a few minutes. And so using my tweezers, my forceps, I'm going to pick it up and put it into this test tube labeled acid. And so let's see what happens. All right, here we go. I'm going to put the liver, this liver's been sitting in an acid for a few minutes. I'm going to drop it into fresh peroxide. And you can see now that the liver is completely submerged in the peroxide, you can see that there's no reaction. There are no bubbles. Now a couple little tiny bubbles, maybe you can see them in the video, maybe not. Little tiny small bubbles. Yeah, you can see a little bit of foam, a little bit of fizz, but not much of anything. Go ahead and make this observation in your data table. The acid test tube produced very few bubbles. So did you notice when the acidic liver came into contact with the hydrogen peroxide, very few bubbles were produced? A little bit. It's not a zero on a scale of 0 to 5. It's not a zero, but a very small amount of bubbles were produced. And so what does this show about the effects of acids on enzymes such as catalase? I'm not going to directly answer that. That's for you to work on in your analysis questions. Okay, so this slide just kind of summarizes the final results. Test tube number 1, when fresh peroxide was added to room temperature liver, test tube number 1 produced a good amount of bubbles. They went up about 2/3 the height of the test tube. Test tube number 2 was the leftover liquid from test tube 1 and a fresh piece of liver, and it produced almost nothing, very few, if any, bubbles. Now, the last part of part A was the used liver but fresh peroxide. That produced a good amount of bubbles. Again, the bubbles went up about 2/3 the height of the test tube. Part B, test tube number 3 was heated in boiling hot water. When the fresh peroxide was added to the heated liver, absolutely really nothing of consequence happened. And then for part C, test tube number 4, the liver was soaked in an acid solution, and when fresh peroxide was added, a little bit of bubbles, a little bit of foaming and fizzing happened, but not much. So go ahead and take these results to finish the rest of your analysis questions. Thanks for watching.